What if I told you that one of the most notorious con men in American history wasn't a hardened criminal, but a teenager barely out of high school? Would you believe it? This is the story of Frank Abagnale Jr., a boy genius who forged millions of dollars in checks, impersonated pilots, doctors, and lawyers, and stayed one step ahead of the FBI, all before his 21st birthday.
He what?
FBI! Hands on your head. Drop it!
Relax. You're late, all right? My name's Alan, Barry Allen, United States Secret Service. Your boy just tried to jump out the window. My partner has him in custody.
I don't know what you're talking about. You see some credentials.
Take my whole wallet.
Hey! Oh, God damn it!
But how long can someone live a lie before the truth finally catches up? In the opening scene of the movie, we are introduced to Frank Abagnale Jr., who is a young man, living with his parents in New Rochelle, New Jersey, where life seems picture-perfect for him. His father, Frank Sr., is a respected community figure, while his mother, Paula, keeps the home filled with warmth. One evening, Frank Sr. is honored by the Rotary Club, and this was a proud moment for the family. Back home, the three share a joyful dance, and this leaves young Frank with the image of a strong and happy household. But the next morning, Frank Sr. unexpectedly pulls his son up from bed to skip school that day and accompany him on errands instead. Their first stop is a tailor shop, where the father asks to rent a suit only to be denied since the store has not officially opened. However, he applies his quick wits as he distracts the shopkeeper with a gold necklace he pretends to have found on the ground. In the end, we see that Frank Jr. eventually got the borrowed suit as his father explains how misdirection works, likening it to the Yankees' pinstripes that distract opponents. The two eventually go to the Chase Manhattan Bank, where Frank Sr. was hoping to secure a loan. However, his request is rejected due to an ongoing IRS investigation on him, and now left without any financial support, the family begins to struggle. They even had to sell their car and eventually lose their home, as they are forced to downsize into a modest apartment. Through it all, Frank Sr. remains determined to teach his son resilience, and on Frank Jr.'s 16th birthday, he gifts him a checkbook with $25 inside, as he encourages his son to focus on creating his own path in life. Shortly after, Frank Jr. transfers to public school. But on his first day, he dresses in his previous private school uniform, making him immediately stand out among others. And even when a bully shoves him, Frank remains composed until when he enters his class, and a student mocks his appearance as some others joke that he looks like a substitute teacher. So Frank chose to seize the moment as he immediately steps into the role, as he orders the students to sit, an order they obey without hesitation, as they now think that he is actually the substitute. For weeks, he maintains the charade, fooling not only his classmates but even holding a parent-teacher conference. His deception goes unnoticed until the principal finally discovers the truth. His mother is shocked when she hears the news, as she worries about her son's behavior. However, Frank Sr., behind his stern expression, secretly admires the cleverness and boldness of his son. Frank Jr. arrives home one evening, only to be shocked by the sight of his father's friend, Jack, emerging from his mother's bedroom. Confused and feeling betrayed, he struggles to process what he just witnessed. His mother, though visibly uncomfortable, attempts to pacify him by offering money, as she hopes to keep him silent, but the damage is already done. Days later, his mood is shattered once more when he walks in to find yet another man in their home. Before he can lash out, the man who is an attorney calmly leads him into the living room, where both his parents are waiting. Then he is hit by the truth that his parents are getting a divorce. The attorney hands him a document and tells him to write the name of the parent he wishes to stay with. But he is overwhelmed with emotion and unable to choose between them. Then without a word, he runs out of the house and continues through the streets until he finds himself at a train station. With nowhere to go, Frank embarks on a desperate journey, as he starts to bounce between hotels and makeshift accommodations, and his only lifeline is the checkbook his father had given him. But he has no money in the account. So, in a bid to survive, Frank starts to forge checks and tries using his wits to cash them in. At first, his attempts are clumsy, and the banks reject him outright. However, he remains determined to succeed as he starts to refine his techniques, learning to manipulate documents and deceive financial institutions. But his breakthrough comes unexpectedly. One day, after yet another failed attempt at securing a loan, Frank's attention is drawn to a tailor's shop displaying an airline pilot's uniform, and as he watches, a real pilot steps out of a taxi, surrounded by stunning flight attendants. The aura of prestige and admiration surrounding him sparks an idea in Frank's mind. If people respect a pilot, then perhaps he could become one, at least on paper. Wasting no time, Frank devises a plan as he immediately starts posing as a high school journalist, and he interviews a professional pilot under the guise of writing an article. He meticulously gathers information, learning everything he needs to pass as a Pan-American captain. Armed with this knowledge, he infiltrates the airline's uniform supply chain, and he eventually manages to secure an official pilot's uniform. But he doesn't stop there as he goes on to use his newfound skills to forge payroll checks in Pan American's name, successfully cashing them and funding his lavish lifestyle. However, his cover is almost blown when he is placed on a flight as a deadhead. He was unfamiliar with the term, and not until he nervously boards the plane that he discovers that deadheads are just pilots that are repositioned for future assignments rather than active crew members. So, his secret remains safe, and his confidence grows. Over time, Frank amasses millions through his elaborate fraud, as he effortlessly charms those around him and slips past authorities. Then one afternoon, Frank meets with his father, eager to show him the success he has built. He even presents him with keys to a brand new Cadillac, but Frank Sr., who is now wary of the IRS and their constant pursuit, refuses to accept it. Their conversation takes a more serious turn as they discuss Paula. His father tells him that he is still holding on to hope, as he tells Frank that he will fight to win her back, and assuring his son that their family will one day be back together again. In the meantime, FBI agent Carl Hanratty starts his pursuit of Frank, and as he follows his latest lead, Carl tracks Frank to a hotel where he is currently staying. He wastes no time as he storms toward Frank's room with his weapon drawn, as he prepares to capture the elusive criminal. But about that same moment, Frank walks past an elderly blind man and his companion in the hallway before entering his room, completely unaware of the danger close by. Seconds later, Carl bursts into the room and starts to search for his target. That is when Frank emerges from the bathroom with a calm expression and even introduces himself as Barry Allen, a Secret Service agent. His confidence quickly unsettles Carl as he demands for his identification, and without hesitation, Frank hands over his wallet. However, he immediately distracts Carl by claiming that his partner has already arrested the suspect. And when he actually looks out of the window, Carl sees a man being escorted into a vehicle, appearing to confirm Frank's story. So he lowers his guard, as Frank makes an excuse to go downstairs, while his wallet is still with Carl. By the time Carl inspects it and discovers that it contains nothing but blank papers, Frank is already gone. After this, his schemes continue to grow even bolder as he poses as an aviation student and convinces professionals to give him access to restricted areas, claiming to be writing a research paper on airline operations. But his charade begins to crack when one man he interviewed tells him about a con artist who is impersonating a pilot. He even hands him a newspaper, and in the paper, Frank sees a phrase branding him as the Skyway Man, and even comparing him to James Bond. He is intrigued by the comparison, and Frank decides to fully embrace the James Bond personality as he starts to watch the latest Bond film. He even acquires the same tailored suit, and even purchases the car model featured in the movie. Now reinvented with style and confidence, he checks into a luxury hotel, where he seduces a woman and spends the night with her as he continues to live out the image of sophistication he now carries around him. Meanwhile, back at the FBI office, Carl spends Christmas Eve alone at his desk after his colleagues have all gone home to their families. The phone rings, and when he answers, it was Frank. He admits that he has been deceiving Carl before and proposes a meeting with him. But Carl sees through the bluff and mocks Frank, suggesting that the call was only made out of loneliness and because he has no one else to talk to. The words hit him hard, and without a reply, Frank silently hangs up the phone. The next day, Carl visits a diner, still wondering who Frank really is. But while he flips through a phone book, a young waiter notices and asks if he's a fan of Barry Allen, which is the real name of the superhero, the Flash. Then, it suddenly dawns on Carl that Frank is just a kid. Armed with this revelation, he orders his team to start searching for missing child cases. They eventually track down Frank's mother, Paula, who is now remarried and living a new life. She cooperates with the FBI and even hands them a yearbook photo of her son. And with Frank's real identity confirmed, Carl finally knows exactly who he's chasing. Meanwhile, Frank, who is unaware of the growing pressure from law enforcement, starts to live lavishly as he throws extravagant parties and basks in the success of his elaborate schemes. At one of his lavish parties, a friend gets into an accident, and he is taken to the hospital, and when Frank arrives at the hospital to check in on his friend, Frank crosses paths with Brenda Strong, who is a young nurse working at the facility. Frank is immediately taken by her kindness, and he impulsively changes his scheme once more as he claims that he is a doctor who is seeking employment. While his reasons for impersonating a doctor remain unclear at first, a letter to his father later reveals that he is exhausted from constantly being on the run as he expresses a desire to settle down, and even hints at his genuine affection for Brenda. Using his charm and wits, Frank successfully cons his way into a hospital position as Dr. Frank Connors. And despite lacking any medical knowledge, he manages to maintain his cover, and his relationship with Brenda also deepens. On one of those days, before their kiss can go any further, Frank is urgently called to the emergency room, where he faces a crisis as he is told that a young boy has been injured in a bike accident. However, Frank once more thinks quickly in the moment and manages to bluff his way through the situation, as he gives vague instructions and miraculously avoids detection. Meanwhile, Carl visits Frank's father to talk to him about his son. And as they talk, it immediately becomes clear to the agent that Frank Jr. inherited his talent for deception from his father, who remains evasive when questioned about his son's whereabouts. But as Carl prepares to leave, he notices a pile of letters on the table. They were letters from Frank Jr., so he quietly takes note of the return address, hoping this would aid in locating his target. In the meantime, Frank's affection for Brenda continues to grow stronger as he starts to envision a future with her. He even proposes marriage, and she joyfully accepts. The two eventually visit her parents over lunch, where Frank weaves a new layer into his fabricated identity, as he claims to be a lawyer just like Brenda's father. This impresses the man, as Brenda even persuades her father to consider Frank for a position at his law firm. But later that evening, Brenda's father privately questions Frank about his true intentions for his daughter. And in a rare moment of vulnerability, Frank admits that he is not a doctor, lawyer, or pilot, but that he is simply a young man who is in love with Brenda. The confession, however, is misunderstood by Brenda's father, who interprets it as a poetic expression rather than the literal truth. And with this misplaced certainty, he gives his blessing. However, after this escape, Frank becomes determined to make himself a legit lawyer, as he starts to study rigorously, and he eventually passes the Louisiana bar exam. With this achievement, he begins working at Brenda's father's firm. But his lack of genuine legal expertise soon betrays him, and during one of his court sessions, he mishandles a procedure, and this immediately draws the scorn of the presiding judge. Meanwhile, outside of work, Frank is drawn to the warmth of Brenda's family as their closeness reminds him of the broken bond between his own parents, and this stirs up a deep longing in him. So, in his hope to try to restore what was lost, Frank meets his father at a bar, filled with optimism about reuniting their family. But the dream shatters when Frank Sr., who now works at a post office, reveals that Paula has remarried. Frank is heartbroken, as he starts to express a desire to leave his fraudulent life behind, but his father urges him to continue. This leaves him torn between seeking stability and escaping, and as he leaves, he knows that he cannot stop running. So, a few days to Christmas, Frank calls Carl once more and offers a truce. He even tells him of his plans to marry Brenda, but Carl tells him that he can't relent now as the law doesn't leave no room for compromise. The statement made Frank quietly accept his reality, as he wishes Carl a Merry Christmas, and ends the call. But Carl quickly acts on the lead as he acknowledges that if Frank intends to marry, he will have to keep his real name, and this will make him easier to track. So he follows this clue, and after finding out the location, Carl infiltrates the wedding party. However, Frank spots him first, and he immediately rushes Brenda to his room and finally reveals the truth to her. He tells her everything, then instructs her to meet him at the airport in 2 days. With that, he says a painful goodbye and disappears once more. And before Carl could enter the room, Frank had already vanished. 2 days later, Frank anxiously waits at the airport, his heart lifting when he spots Brenda in a pink top with her luggage in hand. But his excitement quickly fades when he notices men in black suits around her and in strategic positions around the airport. Realizing he's walking into a trap, Frank immediately aborts the plan and drives away. Meanwhile, Frank soon realized that the FBI now had eyes at all the airports, meaning that he can't escape unnoticed. However, he soon devised a new strategy as he disguises himself as a pilot once again and launches a fake internship program. He manages to recruit 8 young women from a nearby school as he continues to work on his plans to escape without triggering Carl and the security officers at the airport. In the end, Frank executes his plan and walks confidently through the airport doors in full pilot attire, escorted by his entourage of beautiful flight attendants. The security team are even momentarily distracted by the beauties, and this allows Frank to slip away once more as he eventually boards a plane and vanishes overseas. After 7 months, the FBI agency becomes exhausted with the relentless pursuit as they begin to lose interest in the case except for Carl, who remains fixated on catching Frank. Then one day he gets a breakthrough. Carl realizes that the checks Frank has been passing are no longer forgeries, they're genuine. This revelation leads him to consult banking experts, who explain that the type of machine producing such checks is commonly found in certain foreign countries. Then, Carl remembers a detail about Frank's mother's hometown in France. And after connecting the dots, Carl deduces that Frank is likely hiding in his mother's hometown in Montreal, France. So, on Christmas Eve, Carl finally tracks Frank down. As locals gather at a nearby chapel, he enters a small factory and finds Frank, exhausted and messy, printing counterfeit checks by the hundreds. But at that moment, Carl no longer sees him as just a criminal. Instead, what he saw was a lost soul who needed help. So, he expresses his genuine concern as he warns Frank that the French authorities were enraged at him, and they plan to kill him if he doesn't come with him immediately. Now out of options and with no way of escape, Frank finally surrenders. However, when they reach outside, instead of being taken by Carl, he is immediately apprehended by the French police to be locked away in prison. But before they take him away, Carl promised that he would find a way for him to be extradited to the United States. The harsh conditions of the prison in France nearly claims Frank's life, but Carl eventually negotiates his extradition back to the US. During their flight back to the United States, Carl casually questions Frank about how he managed to forge his way through the bar exam. To his surprise, Frank admits that he had studied for 2 weeks and passed it legitimately. Moments later, Carl eventually delivers the devastating news that Frank's father has passed away. The news shatters Frank, as he feels that he has been stripped of whatever little purpose he had left. And as the plane begins its descent, Frank excuses himself to the bathroom. And by the time the plane finally lands, Frank has vanished again, as he slipped through the bathroom stall and disappeared into the crowd. Now a fugitive once more, Frank goes to his mother's new home, as he hopes to at least find some comfort there. But when he arrives, he watches from a distance as Paula tends to her new family, now remarried and even raising a young daughter. The sight devastates Frank, as he sees that she has completely moved on from their old life. Realizing he no longer has a place in her world, Frank finally surrenders, exhausted from all the running from the FBI, as Carl and the other agents take him into custody. He is eventually sentenced to 12 years in a maximum security prison, and this seemingly marks the end of his story. Yet Carl continues to visit him in prison, as he tells him that he has recognized something unique in him. And during one visit, Carl shows him a difficult fraud case under investigation. But within seconds, Frank exposes the counterfeit and even identifies the corrupt bank teller responsible. Impressed by his fast and precise answers, Carl petitions for Frank's early release under one condition: that he use his skills to aid the FBI's bank fraud division. In the end, Frank starts working with the Bureau, though many agents remain skeptical of him. And despite his progress, old temptations resurface as Frank passes by a tailor shop, and he sees a pilot's uniform on display. This stirs old memories in him, and over the weekend, when he starts to feel lonely, Frank once again prepares to escape. But before he boards a plane, Carl intercepts him, and instead of making an arrest, Carl calmly reminds him that no one is chasing him anymore, as he assures him that he is sure that if he runs, he will eventually return. However, the following Monday, Carl waits at the office, very much unsure if Frank will show up. Hours pass without a sign until finally Frank walks through the door, as he has chosen to stay and begin a new life. And by the end of the movie, we are told that Frank Abagnale Jr. ended up building a remarkable career as a leading expert in bank fraud with the FBI, and that he forged a lifelong friendship with Carl Hanratty. And that's the story of the movie, Catch Me If You Can. This movie is a remarkable true life story of Frank Abagnale Jr. If you enjoyed the recap, consider dropping a like on the video and subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching.